Welcome to Automation Caffeine, your dose of invigorating business automation tips packed as interesting anecdotes and questions. We have a different guest every episode from various industries, countries, and backgrounds for a half-hour online chat over coffee. My name is Jesse. I'm co-founder of Triggre, serial entrepreneur, and above all, I am a big coffee snob. And today I am joined by Joram Mossink, a data-driven problem solver, athlete, and the founder of DataMaker, a data consultancy agency. Hey, Joram.
Hey, Jesse, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And we always ask our guests to introduce themselves in 3 words only. So what are your 3 words?
So I picked 3 words that reflect me and what I do. Those are passionate, glue, and utility. And to elaborate a little bit on it, passionate because obviously I really care about what I do and I love my work. Um, I think I would really I get enthusiastic about the idea of spreading the word of joy around data. Then glue, because I think in your toolkit you always gotta have some glue, somebody who sticks everything together, makes everything come alive. And utility, because if you need somebody, I'm probably not necessarily the expert on AI or data or whatever, but I can bring everything together and I can be a nice substitute because I know a little bit about everything that goes around in the data field. And I think sometimes that's exactly what you need when you have all these experts around you and they can communicate with each other. So that's that.
Cool. No, basically, that means maybe this is a too old of a reference for you, but you're sort of the MacGyver of data then, or something.
That's what I would say. Obviously, I cannot grow the same mustache yet. Uh, but yeah, I would say like I dabble a little bit in software engineering. I do a bunch of analysis. I make apps here and there, and I try to figure out like what is that thing that this person needs that can create value. And generally, that has something to do with data. If it has nothing to do with data, I'll figure out a way how to include some form of information or analysis into it because that's something that I really like to do. Uh, and that way, I'm not really the expert, but I do know enough to get by and get everybody connected and together with the right people.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. So that's yeah. So you're indeed like a big problem solver in that way.
Exactly.
That's also one of the main reasons that we wanted to get you on. You work with a lot of companies that want to get more out of their data or want to solve problems with the things that they have in terms of data. What is one of the biggest trends that you see currently with those companies in the market?
So right now, I work a lot in the healthcare sector, and I think if you look ahead 10, 20, maybe 30 years, obviously our parents were very good at making the population grow, and we will we're looking at a scenario where a lot of people have gotten a lot older, but not necessarily healthier.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are going to drop out of the marked participation, or like
Yeah.
they stop working.
Yeah. The working
So
population is going
that's
to decrease a
yeah.
lot. Yeah.
So the amount of people that will need care at the end of their lives, or like the last 20, 30 years of their lives, or maybe 40 years, because we don't know how old people are going to get in the future, it's going to get a lot bigger, maybe even twofold. But the amount of people that are going to be able to take care of them is going to shrink, especially if there's no migration or anything from other countries where maybe this birth rate is a little bit higher still.
Mhm.
And so when I look at the companies that I work for, a lot of them are dealing with this issue that we're already seeing trends of problems that are going to happen in the future, but we know inevitably because of the volume of the amount of care that is needed, it's going to get a lot more and a lot worse. And
Mhm.
so we're trying to figure out like, oh, how can we use data in a way to lessen the load on the people that have to supply the work or increase the health of the people that probably need care later on in the future or predict that, or maybe there's a way in which we can be more effective with how we use our instruments. And that's something that I work with right now. And I think that a lot of companies are struggling with this, not only in healthcare, but like I said, I think we see this all across the board, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we see ourselves see a lot of companies having a question, sort of like, and sometimes it's like super broad, like, what can we do with data? Well, that's not very helpful. So then you're really at sort of the early stages. But yeah, like you said, I I also think that a lot of companies are experiencing more data because there's more sources out there that provide you data, and then
Mhm.
you, is that a problem? Like when there's more sources, do you feel that you have to use all those sources, or would you say like no, like limit the number and start with some things that actually add some value?
I would probably go with limit the number and start with things that add value. Obviously, maybe to combine these things a little bit too. I think a lot of companies have data, but not all companies have a data analyst or a data engineer or a data whatever, a data team. So I think we're already very limited in what we can do with this data if we don't have the right expertise to deal with this. So that in general means that if you have all these sources, you probably want to narrow it down to the ones that you can use. Uh, but also do not limit your creativity. Narrow it down to those things that can be directly applied to a problem that you're challenged with. Because if
Hmm.
you are
Yeah.
digging in the data or in healthcare, whatever, you're gonna find something that's useful. So you might as well start the other way around, start asking questions that are actually relevant to you, and then figure out which sources can be used for that. And in that sense, that's probably going to make the problem a whole lot worse because going to find also that there's probably sources that might be useful to you that you don't have yet.
Oh yeah, that can happen, of course.
So yeah, probably it's probably like a reverse pyramid or something that you have like all these sources you want to scope it down, but you also want to scope it up because the question meets the data somewhere in between.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. Indeed, that you sort of tackle the problem from both sides at the same time to make sure that you get sort of the best fit
Hmm.
on both sides. Oh, interesting. I'd never thought about it in that sense, because we tend to sort of look at what we have and then go from there. But if you do
Hmm.
the other way, then maybe you can meet somewhere in the middle where you're not implementing 17 things that you're missing, but maybe one or two. And then from the other 20 that you already had, you're going to use one or two and then combine those and actually
Hmm.
have quick results.
Oh,
Interesting.
just to interrupt a little bit, like it's when I sometimes do data driven working workshops with companies to try to figure out like how can we make sure that they understand what data driven working actually is. And one of the exercises that I actually got from my psychology background, so totally unrelated to data, is uh, can you actually with what you have perform different functions? So if
Hmm.
I would say, hey, here's a paperclip or here's a shoe. What
Yeah.
else can you do than stick paper together? Or what else can you do than put the shoe on your foot? Because you could probably use a shoe as a hammer. You can probably use a shoe as a storage box.
Yeah.
But people don't think of it that way. People think, oh, I need to use the shoe. So the shoe is tied to this function. So I need to use it that way. I think with data it works the same way. We say data is omnipotent, I think. You can
Yeah.
use it for a lot of different functions, but if you can't tie it to the right application, you're probably just going to have a number somewhere spread out throughout the organization, and everybody's going to want to think something of it, but you're not actually going to use it. And I think for me, that valorization is really important in the process of where we're going to go and how we're going to go forward.
I love that analogy. It makes it very tangible on how to look at data because indeed, I know the exercise differently. Like it's with a brick, same thing. Like how many uses can you come up with for a brick in like a minute or something?
Exactly.
And it's a really smart way to think about data in that way as well. Because if you open your mind a little bit more and try to find not just the obvious one, but it's usually probably the third, fourth one that you look at. That's probably the interesting one, right?
Hmm. Well, I'm actually just one. I want people to open up their minds to the possibility of that there's a lot more behind what you're seeing um, than just what you're seeing. And I think when we go further into the whole data conversation with companies or with people, or just when looking at things, you can actually get a lot of information that is maybe not actually directly related to this data. I think I remember there used to be this time when in Facebook you could install this extension called Facebook Eye, and it basically
Yeah.
all it did was track the time that you would spend on a certain post, and from that, just to tie it to the elections from today, it could determine whether you were a Democrat or a Republican or what type of
Yeah.
products you would think are interesting. And I think specifically that comes from just one tiny little simple parameter, like what
Yeah.
words are you looking at, and how much time did you spend on it relatively to other things? And I think if we can look at data in that way, like the potential is limitless, and I guess also our productivity is limitless.
And how do you do that? Like, because you don't, I don't. I'm assuming that you don't come up with all the ideas if you're the customer. So do you get like a group together that sort of like brainstorms these ideas? How do you get these things? How do you make them tangible?
Well, it's funny you should mention this in Automation Caffeine because that's basically what I do. I do Automation Caffeine with everybody in a company. Uh, I think the home of a company is obviously the coffee machine.
Yeah.
I think that's where you meet people from different departments. I think when you go into a company, usually I come in not in the data team, but I come in the periphery because the periphery tends to hire consultancy agencies or people from
Yeah.
external companies, and where a normal company is sort of made through Säule. I don't know, like basically departments that are very scoped and have like a very narrow objective.
Mhm.
The data team is supposed to actually sort of mesh these things together. I think this is also called a data mesh in some companies that sort of organize it in the right way. And what I try to do is just try to figure out what makes people tick, because the thing that makes people tick also makes them want to ask questions about like how can we improve things, or like, oh, this is really bothering me, like what can we do about it? And I think from that point on you can really easily demonstrate that there's like probably a data source that you can tie to it, or this problem, if we rethinking or if we like translate it into another way to go about it, like what if not all the people go to their work, but we make the work go to all the people? We would have so many less traffic jams. If we just think differently about problems, we would probably be able to tackle them a lot easier. And I think that's exactly what I do, like just try to trigger people their imagination, and sometimes this yields a nice solution. And sometimes I say to people, hey, you know what? I'll come up with a solution, and then I break my head for like a couple of months, and then I'll come across the street, I'll order a sandwich somewhere, and then in the donor shop, there's there's somebody who tells me how he solved problem X and Y, and then I go back to the healthcare, and then
Yeah.
that's probably looks exactly the same. So then I can combine something, that I can glue something from another company into a
Yeah.
company that has nothing to do with what this other company is doing. And I think that's creativity in general, right? You just take something
Yeah.
and apply it somewhere else.
Yeah. And I like how you make it a human process, right? So it's something that's inherently human to see sort of these multiple uses at first, and then discussing them, and also the things that are bothering them in their processes. Which ones do you like want to solve? Indeed, like you said, that is very interesting, because we tend to think about it maybe a lot as a machine thing or something, but actually using it is a very human process. If I hear you speak about it, which I really like. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah, and but I also think it works this way, and I think not to tell bad about like all of the data experts around, because I obviously think all of these people have a place in the world, but I think very often we're bound to think that that the data is the solution to everything, but
yeah,
the data is just a tool. That's why I also call it data maker, because a maker uses a lot of things as a tool to figure out like how to repair something or to make something or to create something out of nothing. And I think very often we say, "Oh, there's this newest thing, the AI hype. Like right now, we have all these LLMs, so we
yeah,
should apply an LLM." Well,
yeah,
the
exactly.
truth is, if you don't have anything to apply an LLM to, or you have no idea how many resources you're going to allocate to it, it's probably not even useful to you if you haven't started asking yourself the question like, "What are our basic problems, or what are we trying to achieve, or like what's ahead in like the next 10 years?" So you need to do some form of exploration, and most of that, I think, takes place in your mind. Like, what keeps you
Yeah,
awake at night?
I fully agree.
Nice.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So on that note, you know that we always have a random question to ask. So we'll see what our wheel of unfortune has in store for you today. Please share the worst advice that you were ever given. Well, there you go.
To kick it off, the worst advice that I was ever given, I will say that
Yeah.
and then translate it later, is met je vrienden moet je wandelen, niet handelen. And in English, this translates to with your friends, you need to walk, not talk, or not negotiate, but talk
Yeah.
about better. And I would say the reason why this was the worst advice is because the person who said this to me was actually actively negotiating with me, uh, a friend, and that didn't work out too well.
Uh-oh.
He wanted me to negotiate, but he obviously wanted to negotiate himself. So that made it the worst advice. Um, However, just to tie it back to the whole data stories, I think that it's truthfully like a good advice because you need to think very carefully about who you want to do business with, especially in this world. Uh, but also, given what we do, you don't want everybody to always go into the details of like every single little line of code that you write or every single little analysis that you do. So a lot of what we do is based on trust. So it's probably better to not talk about sort of the way you're going to do this or how much money you want to have from it, but like it's better to like try to make everybody your friend in this business because the more in depth you want to go, the more it's based on, well, let's not waste any time here. Let's trust each other and like let's try to figure out how I can create the most value for you and make myself feel responsible for something that you really need to achieve. Because in the end, like we're all trying to do this together, we're all trying to make the world go round. If you want to do this the best way, it's best to have everybody as your friend. And also, probably it's good to have a very short memory around negotiations because, like, the money is all supplementary. When we all get like a good feeling about what we're doing for the world, I think this is all that you need to do.
Yeah, that's in. I think many people will look at it differently. But I do agree on the bit where you say basically there's this book called The Speed of Trust, and if you yeah indeed like if you trust people, yeah you'll get disappointed sometimes, but on the whole, coming back to sort of analyzing the data, if you on the whole you actually get way more done if you just open up, trust people, and obviously not in a naive way,
Hmm.
but that way you go a lot faster indeed. And that ties nicely in with how you made it a whole human process because it will definitely be built on trust. And also, I guess the information and the companies that you work with, they share a lot of data with you that you have access to that can be considered very confidential data. So I
Hmm.
think that trust, regardless if you can have a good contract or anything, but damages will be done if you decide to do something with that data that you're not supposed to do with that
Hmm.
data. So I think that trust goes a long way, right?
That's probably inherent to the whole data landscape because
Hmm.
obviously, like the first person that sees this data has to do something to protect it, but we're way more sort of concerned with the fact that we derive value from it than concerned with the privacy. That's I guess why it's such a big issue right now. Uh, that you cannot actually protect everybody from everything, and I think when you look at it in sort of that way, whenever I come into a company and they haven't really thought about this yet, I usually instantly get access to everything, which means that they're inherently trusting me with the fact that I'm not going to do anything wrong and provide value instead. Obviously, I trust myself. I would never do anything wrong. I would go back to the grocery store if I didn't pay for something. True story. Um, but I also think that there's lots of use cases where, like now, you can have somebody who's in the data field, and uh, you need to give this person data, and it's probably easier to let that person explore and figure out like what's there, how can I solve this problem, and how can I do it in a proper appropriate way than doing this iteratively, where you get like a small batch of data, and then every single time that I have to sort of ask for new data, somebody has to work for me because by the time I have the data that I actually need, I'm probably already 2 or 3 steps ahead, and I'm not going to go back to do what I used to do in the past and like redo it with this new data because like I've probably already found a proxy for whatever it is I'm trying to achieve.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can see how that helps. Do you make contracts for these things? Do you have like you probably have some sort of NDA that you usually set up, right? Because some
Yeah,
of the That is very sensitive, I can imagine.
So basic procedure is just to also always write an NDA or a verwerkersovereenkomst, like a
Yeah.
GDPR agreement with each other. It's not always the case, I guess, but
Mhm.
it has to do with the same type of thing, especially if you work for SMEs, small, medium
Yeah.
business, where they probably just don't have the knowledge to think about like how to do this in the proper way. But they do handle a lot of data, and handling this amount of data probably yields some form of like thinking about it. So I'm usually also one of the first people to ask this question. But yeah, I really trust myself. I'm a very honest person. I think this is more or less an obstacle in a way to doing proper analyses and not yeah,
Yeah.
not yeah. I view it as a necessary evil. Let's put
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. For companies that have to uphold certain standards in terms of processes and legal things, they just have to have this contract in place. It's a risk management thing, but still, trust plays a big role. You mentioned SMEs, and one of the things that I really wanted to ask you is, um, many companies might have an idea of, hey, we want to do something with data. Like recently, that's translated a lot to we want to do something with AI. But let's say the companies say like, hey, we want to be more data driven, like make better decisions, etc. Like we hear about all these upsides that it has. What would be sort of a step plan, concrete steps that you could say like, okay, these are like step one, do this, step two, and then like how do you get to that data driven so people can sort of plot themselves on where are we in this journey.
so I think about this a lot because exactly this question gets asked to me by everybody who has ever proposed me a project, which is
I know I've never
yeah.
said that I'm original.
It's basically the question is so we have all this data and
Yeah.
what can we do with it? And I think we need to go back to this question because this question is inherently the wrong way around because the data is supposed to help you do what you do. So
Mhm.
the question is, well, the question that companies that need to ask in the first place, which I guess would be step one, is what do you do and where are the challenges? And then the
Mhm.
question we should ask in the second place is what is data for us? Like very sort of rudimentary. It basically is just numbers,
Yep.
observations, measurements. But I guess a question is just as much data, just qualitative. It says something about like something that you're interested in. And if I would have a company with a lot of data, doesn't matter which business, I would probably try to figure this out before I start to actually ask the question like how to get more out of data. Because
Mhm.
I come in and I like start asking this question, which means that you already lose half of the value of my project by trying to figure out what you actually can answer as the only person. Um,
Mhm.
but I guess it's sort of a little bit of chicken and egg because you don't start asking this question if you don't talk to me, and the other way around. So when we go from that into sort of a project, I would say, okay, so we have this challenge, and I think then it gets like more or less like a scientific paper. I like to sometimes think of myself of having a research background. I probably want to like research my way out of a company. And so when you think about this problem, you want to first define the problem, think about all the intangibles, think about like mind map your way into like which questions you think are interesting, and figure out which one you want to give priority. And you can do that by step three, I think, describing what you know about this thing. So first qualitatively, but then also obviously quantitatively, because you want to know, maybe in healthcare, you want to know something about your population, how many products they use, how many products every person uses, what type of capacity is sort of related to this product, or how much money you're going to spend on X and Y. In a way, people are already doing this before we set up a project because in setting up the project, you already want to know, okay, so how much money do we want to spend on
Yeah.
specifically this, and like how much are we going to gain from it? Because obviously, if you're going to spend like tens of millions of euros, you might also want to see a return in terms of like 10% extra productivity because you're not going to do it for 1% extra productivity.
Yeah.
And so, from this description, I think this is usually the first part. You go into maybe asking some questions that go further into the context. And so this is where it gets very blurry, because from here you probably want to say, okay, now we got like a very vague idea of topic one in department one.
Yeah.
Hey, but what if we do this in this other department? So we start there very vague as well. And the more you start to do this, the better knowledge you start to have about like the thing that you're doing, which you do have a feeling about, but you don't really know what it is. Now you can go into figuring out, okay, so we've got this topic still relatively wide. Can we go deeper into it, or can we valorize it actually? Because you're doing this exploration in step 3. I guess step 4 is now we have this knowledge. How we're going to put it back into the business, or is there a way to automate what we're doing? Maybe a good example is used to be part of this company that used to scan Excel files for the correctness of the data that was in there,
Mhm.
and it was like 10,000 lines per file, and the people that were doing it like spent a lot of time on it, and so they let a robot do it. Like obviously it can be very easily done if you know what you're checking. So if you have defined the product really well, and if you've defined a little bit uh, what you want to achieve, now you can sort of look at it in terms of, okay, we have an idea of what we're dealing with. People are writing their hours, and we see that we spend about 10 hours every week on doing this. It's a highly automatable task because we
Yeah.
figured it out in the exploration. We have figured out how much money we're spending on it. We figured out that these people are probably not the right match for this. Uh, Maybe we can automate it. And so we called in an RPA company, really cool RPA company, robotic process automation. What they
Yeah.
did is they basically automated this process. And very quickly, maybe like a week later, we already forgot about this entire process. And a really, really, really nice hook that I really learned from is that um, we spent 10 hours a week on specifically doing this manually. Then we discovered that we were doing this manually, that we could do it in a better way. Then we spent money on having somebody do it automatically, and then we forgot about it because
Yeah.
now it wasn't a problem to us anymore.
Yeah.
Obviously for the people in finance or the people that were more concerned with the money, it became a problem because now we were spending money on it, and it was very clear that it wasn't money that we allocated to sort of
Yeah.
people, because people money you don't really see. You see
Yeah.
actual money. And what the people did from the RPA company, the robotics company, is they said, well, if it's going to save you 10 hours a week, we might as well put 10 hours a week versus a certain rate into the app. So every time you open up the app, you see how much money it saved you compared
Yeah.
to how much money it actually cost, which was obviously a lot less. And this mind twist made that now all of a sudden I have an insight into, okay, but if I like also use this for this other project in this other department, in this other company, this is how much
Yeah.
more productive we're going to be. And so from this super, super simple task, which was highly automatable, or just describing what we're doing, we have all these little hooks into like, how can we go and take this into like the next level, the next department, the next product, the next problem. And I think when I enter a company, this is usually not there. I'm not to say that just my entry will be this, but I
Mhm.
think people start to take notice and they see this data and they're like, but can you also do this for me? Or like, what if I just gather this? Can we shuffle it around a little bit and like figure out how I can improve myself? And I think this Triggre catches all the early adopters. So like everybody who's like a little bit on edge and trying to improve their work, and then as soon as you get all the early adapters, everybody will be like, you know what, we should really like embrace this. Like data is really the next thing. And then
Yeah.
you get the majority, and then like obviously the companies that are thinking that they're already doing it well will follow last.
Yeah. Really, really cool to see, because we always say like, yeah, you want to automate things to save time so that you can spend more time thinking about bigger things and to automate. Like it sort of becomes a snowball, right?
Hmm.
You just have to get that taste, I think, the first time around, that you see that it actually saves you time. And indeed, maybe it's not immediately something that a financial department will see, because it's usually it's hours saved, but it will influence other KPIs, like you said. Maybe sometimes that's time saved on a certain process, but it can also be customer satisfaction increases. It can be all these things, that you will notice actually, in terms of the broader scope of business. Do you often have a problem when when something like that happens, right? So a finance department sees costs increase instead of costs decrease, regardless of whether they show it in the app. I mean, cash out is higher because you still have the same amount of staff, and now they have plus one tool that they have to pay for. So to a CFO, it might not feel like it's progress. Actually, how do you handle that situation in these organizations?
Good question. I don't think I handle that question. I think that's maybe also inherently part of the problem. Like as a C-level executive, you probably want to
Mhm.
have an overview about everything, but not really necessarily want to go into depth. So
Yeah.
they don't see the details of this specific trade-off. Maybe you see like an increased revenue because you can handle more projects, but like in general, it's I think what they call marginal gains. So
Yeah.
like for me as an employee, it's probably it's like a quarter of my time as in a 40-hour work week. But for the CEO, a quarter of the time out of 6,000 employees is really not that much.
Yeah.
And when you really start to think of it, like how many times am I in a meeting with like 4 or 5 other people? That's going to waste
Mhm.
so much money, so much potential. Or how do we think about like the resources that we're using? Are we actually using it in the right way or in the right order? I think the part of the problem is nobody has a crystal ball which they see everything, the past, the future, and everything that goes around them at the same time.
Yeah.
Would be really nice if somebody had that, but every use case has this different type of information. I try to figure this out. I think the most perfect player you would put in this situation is somebody who has ADHD, somebody who has like a very short attention span, but can take and sample things from everything and then hyper focus it together into like one probably incoherent story. And I think this person might be really important because you're gonna catch things that you probably haven't heard of before. Whereas people that are very scoped, that have a very narrow task, are only going to deal with their narrow task, even though that narrow thing might be a replacement of something else. Um, I like to put myself into that situation. I think this is the role that I take in every single company. Like sample a little bit there, sample a little bit there, and then I see 2 projects, and then for some reason, if we like just make like one little change in the line of code, all of a sudden data becomes applicable to 2 projects. Or there can be a trade-off where if this project does really well, then the other project will probably do less well or better, and then we have to think critically about how to achieve this. Um, don't necessarily know if this answers sort of the dilemma that we're dealing with, but I think
Yeah.
every little bit of extra productivity, yeah, to come back to the very
Yeah.
very first problem, we're not going to have the manpower to deal with all these problems in the future.
Yeah.
Is going to be something that's worthwhile to do, and then however much money it costs, let's hope it always costs less money than the productivity that it gains us.
Yeah, I think that's the way to look at it. I think it's a short term versus longer term, or like not even long term, but like slightly longer term issue where in the short term it will cost you something because yeah, your costs will go up. But then if that saves you hiring someone, then it's easily made back from that point on. That's maybe not as visual as saving 5K per month or something or 10K per month immediately, but it does help, and I think that you can relate that to some KPIs. Like you can always make a KPI out of it, right? Like, hey, maybe we don't have as many open job opportunities anymore. If we go from 100 to 50 positions, that is definitely an improvement in sort of our productivity. If we can do the same with fewer people needed, even if it's not immediately a cost saving. And same with this, we always try to, and I think that you're doing the same thing, but we're always trying to find a KPI that sort of makes it applicable to upper management. Like, hey, we automate something, and this is the improvement that you've seen,
Hmm.
regardless of whether that is money. Obviously, it's easiest if it comes down to some euros or dollars, but sometimes that just doesn't happen, and it's more indeed like, hey, we save 10 hours of this team per week that we can now put into other things that will actually show results after that.
Hmm.
So yeah, it does help, and I think it's also important for companies indeed to be able to voice that to their upper management. Like, yes, we understand that. It didn't immediately provide
But
provide maybe a discount.
maybe this is something that we as data people can learn a lot from, because obviously as a data person I don't cater just to the upper management. I also cater to the middle management, and I also cater to the operational folk. And I try to split them up, but like
Yeah,
we get a little bit hacky from time to time, and so I went into a lot of companies where everything gets placed onto a dashboard,
yeah,
and probably also all together. And I think what it really comes down to is you have to break it down into the pieces that people care about the most. And so you might have everything into a dashboard, but like organize it in such a way that if I'm coming in and I'm like upper management, I probably care about like three things tops, and I want to see those at the first, like as soon as I get it. And if I don't understand, I probably want to like drill down on those things. Uh, where I don't think we've, as people, had the proper training is like, how do we actually organize it in such a way that it's a logical story for somebody to go from one KPI into all the questions that derive from it? Because very often that probably warrants a lot of combinations of information that weren't there before, which maybe you can already think of ahead of time. Because as soon as there's a deviation from what you think is sort of the like the status quo, such as
yeah.
we've now have this extra tool, but we don't have like sort of less FTEs. Um, you want to sort of go into depth on it, and I think you cannot leave this up to a machine. Like there's got to be some human power involved into it, thinking, okay, so now there's this deviation. Let's go into like, is this important to us to figure out if this deviation is good or not? Because if it's extra revenue, like maybe you want to know something about it to exploit it. But most of the times, people don't really want to know things when we're in black numbers. People want to know things when we're in red numbers. So
Yeah,
when there's red numbers, everybody goes to work, and like I think from there, every single time that there's a deviation somewhere, like you got to put the analyst to work. You got to like start putting. I actually I wrote this down for myself. Like you start working data driven in the intersection of data and work.
hmm,
You can switch them around. You can say work driven data or data driven work works the same way. um, the data is supplementary to the work, but at the same time, like if you want to do the work well, you have to like explain what you're actually doing, why you're doing it, like why this is important. And for sometimes you need the data there. So the driven part is actually the part where now me and an operational person or somebody who's actually working with that data or can make decisions need to sit together and think, what are the possible ways this could have come about? Or is there a way in which, let's take Formula One, for example. We can make Max Verstappen drive even faster than he's already doing. Like he's already
yeah.
getting the most out of what we're giving him, but like, is there a way we can give him exactly that which he's good at? And like, what is that thing? Why don't we get to see that as people? Because there's probably like millions of fans that have all these ideas that we can make it better. Like we can crowdsource solutions basically.
Yeah, yeah, that's probably you can indeed. At least some of them. I mean, for some, you might have to have very technical knowledge and understanding of certain processes. But I think that there's a lot of let's say low hanging fruit indeed that can be solved in this way. Um,
Absolutely.
this is right now. This is all the questions that I have prepared, but we do have a couple that we have coming in that I'll get to ask you. Let's see. This one's interesting. Okay, Brian says, can you share an example of how you've applied derived data to address business challenges? So derived data, if for people who don't know, is you have data points, but then obviously, like always, an example that I give to people is if I send you my location every minute, then that's only my location, you think, but I can derive from that where you live, where you work, and all these things, like maybe which supermarket you like to go to if you combine it with data points. So that's what derived data is. And yeah, can you give an example? That's an interesting one.
Hmm.
We combine data into
Yeah.
new information.
So when I worked in a hospital, and one of the things we were looking at is looking at therapies that were prescribed for melanoma patients, generally patients that are not super well off in terms of like their prospects. And in the Netherlands, or as far as I know, you can only give three types of treatment. And when you look at the data, like obviously you can only get sort of the administrative part of the data. So like when is something applied and when does it end? And so in summarizing this for all of the patients, uh, and combining it with the value that they derive from it, such as did they get another treatment? Yes or no? Did they sort of lead a long and healthy and sustainable life after that? Yes or no? We can all of a sudden see the value of a certain type of medication with a certain type of patient.
Mm.
I think if we start broadening this out into the wide scope of sort of melanoma cancer across the world, we would probably get to know a lot about like how different types of people respond to different types of treatment. Um,
Yeah.
I think maybe another small example is during COVID, a lot of people came in and it took a day for them to get their PCR test run. So we didn't actually know whether people had COVID or not. And one of the SEH, the spoedeisende emergency department doctors, said, but like we can get results for lab values within 15 minutes. So why don't we just like get those and try to figure out if the COVID patients have different lab values than the non-COVID patients? Which
Yeah.
saves a lot of time, I guess,
Yeah.
because
Given the
initially
fact
you had to
if
isolate
something
everybody, and
comes
now you
out
can
of
just
that, then
isolate
it
the
saves
people that
time,
look
right?
different.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so we
Huh.
did this, or
Yeah.
we tried to figure this out also with a bunch of hospitals, or like at least one other hospital. We figured out that their calcium values were significantly different.
Huh.
Um,
Interesting.
Obviously, like you would have to go into depth what the specific mechanism is, why COVID and calcium interact differently with each other. I think there's probably like a scientific basis for that.
Yeah.
But specifically, this indicator could already sort of be like a nice way to say, hey, we don't actually know if you have COVID or not. We don't actually know if we should isolate you or not. But based on what we have, we can give a good indication of what's going on underneath the surface. There could obviously be like a host of different reasons why you would have elevated calcium,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it would
Yeah.
prevent the entire system from collapsing because everybody might get whatever you have from you. I
But
think
it's
we
if
can
it's
probably
if
go
it's a
into this.
really
Yeah.
yeah, if it's a strong correlation, it's a very, very cool tool, and you can speed up the process so much. So that's a really good example. That's really good.
Yeah.
I
And
had no idea about
yeah, so I
this.
think in the end the effect size was relatively small. We're trying to figure out if this is something that's actually applicable. But I think obviously now you look at this as sort of a tool all of a sudden because this lab
Yeah,
value, everybody comes into the hospital, let's draw some blood.
yeah.
Easy
That's
as
like
that.
step one, right? Yeah,
And we've completely optimized this process. So I think if you deduce, and this is the derived data, huh? If you deduce
yeah.
from that that something's going on, now all of a sudden you can interact with it and you can do stuff that is a whole lot faster than if you didn't do that beforehand.
Cool. Yeah. Nice, nice. Thanks for that example.
No worries.
Peter has the following question. What are some common misconceptions companies have about data?
Yeah, a hard question. I think the thing is, as a company, I'm very prone to say, you know what, let's just spend money on data, and
Yeah.
then it will automatically increase our productivity. I think this is the most common misconception in the world. I think it is a very nice and easy way for our job as data experts, as more specifically right now, I think AI experts to find a footing inside of a company that doesn't have the data maturity to like work with everything yet. And I
Mhm.
think it definitely accelerates the process. But I think very often also these people end up getting disappointed in what they're actually investing in because if you haven't defined very well beforehand why you would want to use this data, why would you spend this amount of money on something that you know is probably well that you probably don't know is gonna succeed? If we can like get rid of this misconception that data is the be all and end all of everything, now all of a sudden we start focusing on like what are we doing? How can we get better? And data can be a solution to that.
Yeah.
That would be my guess. Obviously, there's lots of misconceptions around data. I think a lot of people cannot really make it as simple as it sometimes is, and obviously it can also be very complex if you want it to be really complex.
One that you've at least made very clear to me is that it's not the starting point. In any case, you definitely start from the other side, at least as well as the data side, at the very least.
It is
Um,
I call it the paradox of data. It's not about the data. It's and Michael Jordan said it's not or like somebody Spike Lee I think said about Michael Jordan it's not about the shoes, it's about the person who's in them.
yeah,
And so that's why you always see now in the Nike ads it's not about the shoes. Well,
yeah.
with the data, it's not about the data. It's as easy as it is.
Nice. I like that. Let's see. Sarah asks, how do you handle situations where data from third parties may not be reliable? Assuming obviously processes might have some third-party data to combine them. Yeah, how would you handle that?
Oof, probably not use it. Yeah. That really depends on the question that I'm trying to answer. If I'm trying to answer a question for which I really need this type of data, we would have to go into depth on why it's not reliable or
Yeah,
valid. I think there's a distinction, of course, here. Reliable means that something comes in the same way every single time, and valid
yeah,
means this is exactly what I need. If it's not valid, I should probably ask myself the question if this is the data that I want to have. If it's not reliable, that could mean that it might not come as often as I want to have it, or not in the same sort of format as I want to have it. That's a whole different problem to deal with. And I guess reliable is probably a little bit easier to work with because, yeah, well, if I just have to do some manual labor to get it in the right format, that's not as much of a problem. It's just a little nuisance. Uh, if it's not trustworthy, valid, if it's not exactly what it's meant to be, now I will have to go into detail. And maybe a good example is product codes in a hospital. I actually was reminded of it just yesterday. Is they are very often right, or at least minimally right, but not often the
yeah,
exact thing that is being done.
yeah,
Because somebody may come in and be like, "Oh yeah, but you know what? Like I'll just also put this bandage on," which might be a completely different product, but because it was like the person was already there, he's innovating the process actually to make it more effective. So for me, I like when going into depth and trying to answer a question about what is this time used for, I'm probably thinking this is more non-systematic, so something that doesn't happen very often, and so it's less of a problem for my data. And on the other hand, obviously, you have to take this into consideration that this is something that introduces some noise, but there will always be some noise in data, and so we'll just have to evaluate like, how often does this happen. Is this something that's really common? Is this something that's not really common? We should probably do whole studies on that, but we probably have to make some assumptions here and there.
yeah. Okay, we have time for one more, and this one I think is really nice. How has being an athlete influenced your approach to data problem solving? I love that because for those who don't know, one of our listeners does know. We have to give a big shout out to David Ironside, who said he's listening. But we know each other through sports, both being athletes. So yeah, this is interesting for me as well as a point. But how has it influenced your data problem solving skill set?
uh, Probably without being an athlete, I would not be in this business. I would probably be a psychologist asking people questions. Um, I so for a little background, I started playing baseball when I was 10, 11, 12. And then together with my dad, we would make the websites for the baseball teams. And one of the things about baseball is that it's very easy to break it down into small little pieces. Everything that happens is an event, and about every event, you can make a measurement.
Yeah,
And the most easy measurement is if you step up to the plate, try to hit a ball, how often do you hit the ball? You should get an average. Well, in baseball, obviously you measure everything. So like we started doing the stats and like putting it online, and I thought that was a really nice side project with my dad. And I think from that, my interest got sparked into okay, well, if I'm just measuring things and that says something about somebody's success rate, why don't I just also start to measure other things as well? And right now, I play ultimate frisbee. I haven't played baseball in a really long time, I'm still very enthusiastic about the whole baseball sort of development of statistics, but I'm also trying to figure out like how can we apply whatever is happening there or in American football or in basketball to what is happening here in my sport where this entire infrastructure is basically not there. There's obviously some apps. So last year, because I was injured, I took up a coaching gig
Yeah.
actually, and I built an app, very small, tiny app that just counts the amount of times that we gave the disc to the opponent, a turnover. And based on that and the combination with which line was playing at the same time, I could run all kinds of analyses and try to figure out, hey, oh wait, hold on, these people that are on the field are actually a lot better at like generating turnovers from the other opponent than turning it over themselves. So why don't we just put them on offense and I put another team on defense?
Yeah.
And yeah, I've been really thinking about like how can we improve this? Can we put people in certain roles? And now all of a sudden, like I'm both the person on the work floor and the data analyst. So like I'm trying to figure out like how can we get people enthusiastic to do things? And so for starters, next weekend I bought some speed gates. So basically a timing gate when you run through it, the timer goes on, and then when you
Oh
run
yeah.
through the finish, the timer goes off. And I hope that's my hypothesis is that this will show some discrepancy with people that can be placed in different roles. And if you do enough different tests, now we can research them into, hey, this person might be better as a how do you call it, like a field marshal or something, or a striker in soccer. And so I'm thinking gathering all this data might help me solve some problems in a non-technical field, maybe a lot faster.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks for this. These are all our questions. David said hi back in the chat. So thanks for tuning in. Everyone else, also thank you for tuning in. We'll be back again with a new episode in 2 weeks. Joram, thank you so much for joining me. I had a great time having you on.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.